a good Nacht, a good Oven. It's Baruch Haba. It's good to see everybody. Welcome. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to 9to NY. It's a privilege to sit with this esteemed panel and to be able to discuss a monumental occasion. And to be partnering also with Evo is really, it's a privilege and it's a treat. And I only wish my parents were here. I don't know, maybe they didn't get the memo. I grew up in a house where my father speaks fluent Yiddish, my mother too. And of course they knew great literary works within Yiddish. And so for those of you who are here and those who are online, it's really, this is a Shechianu, it's a big moment for us. And so thank you for being with us. So we're gonna kind of try to make our way through the questions for the panelists and also leave room for your questions and your thoughts. And knowing also that you know, we want you to go out and read the book. So we'll get through the questions. So I'm going to begin with some questions for both Rose and for Todd. You know, it's always challenging to translate, and you know, things are lost in translation. And I wonder for those, you know, of us who might not be fluent in Yiddish, are there things about Yiddish and specifically Grade's Yiddish in particular that made it more complicated than, I guess, another work that might have been translated?
Okay, so do you want me to speak with a mic, or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Because there are people online.
Okay, so in a sense, it was less complicated for me, just because his Yiddish was very familiar and felt very Heimish to me, similar to what I'm used to.
Heimish is?
Heimish, homey, like, you know, basically what I'm used to hearing in my Hasidic community.
You grew up in Satmar?
Yes. I live in Williamsburg. I belong to the Satmar community, and from birth, and still living there. So in a sense, it was less complicated for that reason, because a lot of it was very familiar. But what made it maybe a little bit more challenging was that Grade was so learned, and he uses a lot of Lashon Kodesh words, a lot of Pesikim, a lot of verses, biblical verses, and he uses them like very commonly in his prose. And that's something that's a little bit challenging to translate, because how do you show the difference if everything is in English? How do you kind of like show, no, this was actually like at a bit of a higher register. And in some cases, actually, it's not at a higher register. That's just the way they would speak. They would just intersperse the Lashon Kodesh words. So that's like one part. Did you want to say anything about that?
I'll chime
in. Was that kind of the question, or was
the
second part? I can't remember.
I just think that was Grade, so just to recap, so Grade was very Hamish, was very homey, that was kind of very much similar to what you grew up with, but also he interspersed and wove in, like many other Yiddish writers too, actually, and Zionist writers, others who had been, like Achadam and others, who grew up with the full canon of Jewish wisdom and, you know, Talmud and verses from the Bible and Tanakh. So that was a bit more challenging, just to kind of find, and also to find the tone of that.
Right.
How would you say it? Right. So that was
right, in a sense, but also in a way, the part that was more challenging was that his Yiddish is purer than what I'm used to as a Hasidic woman, obviously. So in a sense, his Yiddish vocabulary is so much above what we speak, and so many unfamiliar words, that almost like the Lashon Kodesh words and the Pesikim were much easier for me, because I hear that.
The Hebrew and the verses.
Exactly, yeah, okay.
I'm translating for the translator.
Thank you. But yes, that was in a sense easier for me to figure out than some of the vocabulary and some of the idioms that he used. Although I will say that a lot was familiar.
Go ahead, Todd. Yeah, jump in.
Just to jump in on the other side of the question of what it's like to approach Grade's language as an English language reader. Does it feel like you're losing, you know, all these meanings coming from the Yiddish? I mean, that was my experience. You know, I came to this project in, I think, 2022 as a translator of Italian literature, who works on translation all the time. doesn't know Yiddish, came to Rose to work on this text to just make the English as good as it could be. So approaching the text from that angle, it never felt to me like I was excluded or that there was so much that I could never understand. And along with my colleague, Alti Karper, who's here with us, we put together a very robust glossary. So we were able to leave so much of the language in its original form and allow the reader to engage with the vocabulary and the feel of the text. So, yeah.
Can you give us some examples, maybe of Yiddish idioms or syntax, a Yiddish idiom or syntax that reveals something about character or psychology or a cultural conflict?
I'd have to have the book in front of me to remember, especially that this was done over a while. But, for example, Grade very often compared people to trees. And there is that concept within Yiddishkeit that I was very, very familiar with, like still from my school days of Eitz Chaim He L'Machazikim Ba, like the Torah is like a tree, or that people are like trees. So that whole concept, again, felt very, like we think that way. And I wondered, like when I was translating it, like how somebody who was not familiar with this culture, how they would feel. But there was a lot of that. I did learn a lot of names for trees and for plants, and that I did not know before. But yeah.
So much texture, clothes, food, rooms, lights. I mean, just you feel like you're in the world. And
but at the risk of flattening some of what we've talked about, we should remember that Grade was the great novelist of Misnagdic orthodoxy. He was not the great novelist of Yiddish Chassidish. So in a way, Grade was always
can you
of the Chassidic
unpack
world.
the difference between Misnagdim?
He is from the Lithuanian, the Litvak world, as opposed to the Chassidic world. And I think in many ways, this was Grade's ability to carve out a space for himself in Yiddish literature. That when you think of so much of Yiddish literature of the late 19th and early 20th century, a lot of it is excavating the Hasidic world and the Neo-Hasidic world. Grade, as he came of age in the 1930s, said, aha, I'm going to be the inheritor of the mantle, not of Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism, but of the mantle of Bialik. So if we think of Bialik's great Hebrew poem, Hamasmid, the Torah scholar, right? Here we have Grade over and over again in different iterations, whether it be in the epic poem of the late 30s, or whether it be in the philosophical debate of the early 1950s, or whether it be in the novels of the 1960s. He's recalibrating how we look at that world of Torah study, but not Torah study in the spiritual stream of Hasidism.
As an intellectual pursuit.
So he's really coming at this as one of the singular voices able to excavate that world of Litvish, of Litvak, of Lithuanian Jewry, and all of its intellectual achievements, and was a product of that world as a student.
Yeah, Wayne, go ahead, Adam.
And I think the one thing that's, excuse me, interesting is that, so you have to remember that he's writing this novel in the 1960s and 70s in the Bronx, and it's a novel set in the early 1930s. And at the end of the novel, there's a character introduced named Klavna, who's clearly based on the author. He's clearly Chaim Grade's version of himself, and he is a young Yiddish poet. He comes and he's wooing someone who's one of the main characters. He's a young Yiddish poet. In that time and place, being a young Yiddish poet had a very specific culture and political meaning. It meant that he was rebelling against religion. He was a secular writer. Like most Yiddish writers and like most Jewish writers until, outside of America, but certainly in Eastern Europe, he grew up being educated in very strict and intricate Jewish tradition. So all of that is in the book, and it's a book about rabbis. Basically, the entire book is about two rabbis and their families who are connected by marriage. And it's about the older generation who have these two great rabbis who want their children to cling to the past, to cling to orthodoxy and tradition, and all of their children rebel and are choosing different paths into the future. So one becomes a communist, and one becomes a Zionist, and one wants to go into business and make money. That is sort of the basic plot of the novel. So there's this sort of deep and poignant irony about it, which is that the future that the young Grade imagined was that he was going to not be in the rabbinic world, not be in the religious world. He was going to the Jew on the streets in places like Vilna who spoke Yiddish, who were secular or rising secular, and write about their lives and their world. And then, because of the Holocaust, that world was destroyed, and the world that he grew up with was destroyed. And he had to sort of decide, how do you write about a world that he was originally rebelling against now that it's gone? And he decided to go back and sort of become its memorialist. I think I quote I wrote the introduction for the book, and I think I quoted something he said in an interview about being a gravestone carver of my vanished world, he said. So he ended up writing, and this is part of why the language, I think, of the novel is complicated, and not just the language, but a lot of the references and the concepts, is that he's writing about this very developed, very complicated social, political, intellectual, religious world that is now gone. It's not completely gone. There are descendants of it. There are offshoots of it in places around the world, in America, in Brooklyn, in New York, in Israel. But in Eastern Europe, it's gone. So he is sort of bringing it back. He's sort of trying to honor it by writing about it in great detail. And that's one way in which Grade is very, very different from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who I think is the Yiddish writer that most of us know. I don't speak Yiddish. I don't read Yiddish, only in translation. And I think if people know one Yiddish writer, it's Isaac Bashevis Singer. And if you know two Yiddish writers, it's probably him and Sholem Aleichem. And Grade is very different from both of them. He's not at all like reading Singer. One of the differences is that Singer is very sort of radical and very modern. He feels very modern. He feels like he's writing about sort of a modern world and lots of parables and fantasies and myths. Grade is basically a realist. It's a very realistic, very long, sort of slowly paced, aggressive, rich, full portrait of this world that he grew up in.
I would just add, if I could,
I don't need to get through my questions. We're here to hear you guys.
I would just add that
you're answering almost all of the questions anyway, so we're going to come up with new questions.
The degree of cultural thickness is incredible in this book. Sort of the details. The book moves according to the liturgical calendar, moving from different holidays and their moods. And what is so, to piggyback on what Adam said, what's so fascinating about this text is even as he engages in this literary, in some ways, archaeology, he is completely resistant to what we might recognize as a saccharine or sentimental way of depicting that world. That is, this is a world that's entirely pitched. It's unbelievable when you read this text. I had a chance to reread it over the weekend, and everything is anger, shame, depression, learnedness, debate. We're not used to seeing that necessarily, or that's not our expectation necessarily when we come to Yiddish literature.
Well, let's take a pause here and put a bracket around all of these pieces, and just and from this point depart into a bit of the biography of Chaim Grade. I mentioned this to you, Justin. You mentioned, it refuses to be saccharine. It refuses to paint a picture that would be inaccurate, or that term is loaded, but from his own perspective, he brings both his rebellion and his reverence. The rebellion and the reverence are both there, and that produces something very real from our perspective. Tell a little bit about Chaim Grade himself, and if you met Chaim Grade on the street, what would it be like to meet this author?
So, I mean, first of all, this is an author who's not compromising. Right? He's not compromising to the audience that is America of the 1960s when he's writing it. His only sort of standard is the standard of a world that he knew, which was a world that was divided between the world of an education that he rebelled against and a world of Yiddish poetry that grabbed his attention and his excitement and then was also torn out from beneath his feet. But he was born in 1910. His father is a maskil and an enlightener and also a Hebraist. And at an early age, his father dies. And he ends up living with his mother, impoverished. His mother sells apples on the side of the street in Vilna. And at a certain point, she recognizes in the young Chaim that he has particular talents. He's a smart kid. And she imagines, what would the great honor to be? for him to become an Eloi, for him to become sort of a rabbinic genius of his generation. And but she sends him to the most extreme
Is that
form.
like the version of like an influencer today?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Like, you know,
So
like he's gonna memorize
Eloi,
Talmud. He's gonna be like, put him on a.
But she sends him to the most extreme form of yeshiva that she can find in the area. That is the Novaraduker Musar yeshiva. So he grows up in his youth, not only hearing thou shalt not, but the whole version of Novaraduk Musar was to uproot the ego, uproot and completely reform the self. But at the same time, and this is what's amazing, at the same time that he's studying in the Novaraduck Musar Yeshiva, which is an extreme form of learning, he's also a disciple of the Chazon Ish, which is a who's living in Vilna at the time, which is a completely different brand of orthodoxy. Many Haredi Jews see the Chazon Ish as one of the founders of Haredi Judaism, and he was seen as someone who supported his students. So he's going from the Novaraduck Yeshiva to the Chazon Ish and sleeping on the Chazon Ish's couch sometimes when he goes back to Vilna. The Chazon Ish leaves Vilna in the early 30s. Grade is broken, and it's at that moment that he decides to become a modern, even a modernist Yiddish poet. And what does he come out with as his first work? In the mid-1930s, as a member of the modernist experimental group Young Vilna, a poetry book called Yo, that is, yes. So if his youth learning was no, his first sort of step into the world of Yiddish poetry is yes. And that is where he thinks his future is going to be. And then, of course, the war comes, and he runs away thinking that the Nazis won't touch Jewish women, and he leaves his wife behind, and his wife is murdered in the war. And the next time we hear of Grade is after the war, coming back to a world that was perhaps the capital of the unofficial Republic of Yiddishland, which is in complete pieces, right? And he has to then figure out where does a Yiddish writer go? His best friend in the group, Avram Sutzkever, the greatest Yiddish poet of the post-war period, goes to Eretz Yisrael, right? Establishes himself in Tel Aviv. The great firebrand of that group, Shmerke Kaczerginski, goes to Buenos Aires. For Grade, he ends up in Paris and then comes and establishes himself in New York, where probably uncomfortably his main antagonist, as Adam mentions, becomes Singer, who is also comes from a rabbinic household. And has sort of this playful understanding of what it means to be a modern writer, how to write for an audience, how to be sexy, how to be coy, how to play with Jewishness at the precise moment when Jewishness is becoming something different in America in the 60s and 70s. And Grade, in his anger, in his sort of Musar boy, he can never really leave the yeshiva. So at the one and the same time, there are stories of Grade, going to McDonald's and ordering a cheeseburger, and then writing these great works of misnagdic religious civilization, and feeling joy and reveling in that, and probably also feeling ashamed of that at the same time, angry with himself that he couldn't be fully in one world and fully in the other world.
Can I just say?
Yeah,
oh.
you don't know permission.
So no, what I want to say is because so much of what you said, you can kind of see in the letters. While we, I don't know if you know was anything mentioned about the history of this book, that we started out thinking it was just a 250-page novel, and then it turned out that it was unfinished, and we started searching for, where's the rest of it, and then slowly we found a whole bunch of parts. So in between that, one of the things that made me aware that there was a second part was that I was introduced to a whole selection of letters that Grade had written to Abe Bornstein, who was his patron and who supported him. So a lot of what you're saying, you can see not only in his novels, but in these letters. And I think they're an amazing resource, for people who can access the language. I think Evo digitized them, so if you can get to see those, he talks about this constant push and pull between his memories and between and his yearning for the Chazon Ish and for that life and for the yeshiva life, and yet he wants to be a thoroughly modern Jew in New York. And so that's mentioned there. And then just a whole bunch of like what the same kind of space that he allows in his novel for different opinions and different approaches, and not sentimental. I'm not going to have the word. And say lizing. I was going to make it into a verb, but okay. So not being overly sentimental or saccharine, but also not being cynical and kind of derogatory about that life. All of that you can also kind of see in the letters. So I just wanted to mention that because they're kind of amazing.
So thank you for that, and thank you for also telling us a little bit about the lost pieces and how it came that you would have the full work. I'm taken, as somebody personally in my own biography, I also grew up in an Orthodox home and then became ultra-Orthodox for 5 or 6 years, went to a number of these yeshivot that you were speaking to, and then left and felt that, and still do, frankly, if you ask my wife, like the torment of sorts of kind of like a world that I had seen but had an allegiance to and I felt obligated towards, but also felt pulled to something else, and how to integrate and kind of that becoming for Grada in his own work, how he becomes this representation of a new world and an old world coming together. I'm wondering as translators, and we can go around, and also for you as a critic, like as a gravestone digger, as you would say, somebody who was marking gravestones and dedicating himself to memory and dedicating himself to tradition, even as he was also wrestling with it. Is translation a sacrilege to that wrestling in some sense? In what sense is translation, if part of what Grada was trying to recapture was also not just the culture, the characters, and the dynamic, but in the language itself, is it possible to not, on some level, what's lost isn't just, okay, we can't accurately translate, but also his project of kind of trying to make of the past, to conjure the past through Yiddish itself. Is that something, obviously, we know it's quite beautiful, I'm sure, but what do you say to that or that question?
First of all, I'd say, what's the alternative? It's in Yiddish only, and you lose access to so many people who want to, partake in these memories and relive that world and enter it and all its intricacy. And I think
could Grada have written it in English? Well, he didn't know. His English was not. It wasn't Elie Wiesel. He wasn't right. Right. I see. Yeah. Right. Right. So keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think yes. So first of all, the alternative is no one who's an English language reader gets to read it. But then I think a great translation can and does preserve those things. I don't think.
Yeah.
I'm very optimistic about translation. The lost in translation thing, I think you lose a lot when it's poorly translated. I think if it's well translated, you can carry over the jokes. Maybe the punchline is a beat later in the English. You make sacrifices, you turn sentences around, you add glossaries, you keep the texture. You do all these things in loyalty to the author and into their vision. And I think the book itself is testament to how successful that has been in English.
And I'll say also that something is always lost when we speak to someone. What they hear is not necessarily what we're saying. So something is always lost in communication. And so when we translate, could something be lost? Look, we're definitely, a good translator will try to retain as much as possible while also being very loyal to the target language. You can't be more loyal to the source language than to the target language. They're both your babies. You want them both to be great. But just like every reader will pick up different things, even if they're all reading it in the same language, it's going to register differently based on your lifestyle, your experiences, your way of thinking, your thought patterns, all of that. So with translation, So there's that other element to it, but I don't necessarily feel like it's much of a compromise. I think it's, it's we would say a lechatchila instead of a b'diavad,
So I wanted to ask you, Adam. So the characters that Grada usually depicts are often grappling with kind of existential doubt and the burden of moral inheritance. So as a poet and a critic, how do you interpret the inner drama of faith and betrayal that plays out in this novel?
Well, one way to look at it is to say the most famous story from Yiddish literature is the story about Tevye and his daughters, right? And thanks to Fiddler on the Roof. And that's a story about a father and his children who in various ways defy him to lead more modern lives. And if you just took that as the sentence, that's what this book is about too. But that book is done, Sholem Aleichem's stories are comic and heart-tugging and sentimental and very sort of simple and direct human stories. And this is more of a and I think one of the reviewers of this book compared it to Thomas Mann. And you could compare it to Thomas Mann because it's a novel of ideas. It's about, it's not just about simple, ordinary people, it's about intellectuals and rabbis and ideologues and communists and all different kinds of people. So it's not just about the lives they lead, it's also a lot about the arguments that they have about what's the right way to be a modern person, to be a modern Jew. And so there are a couple of distinct characters that represent different paths. There's one who becomes a communist revolutionary. There's one who becomes an intellectual and becomes sort of a sub-academic at a university in Switzerland and speaks and writes in German and marries a Christian woman. There's another, and those are the men. There's one who becomes a Zionist and sort of stands up for the Jews and fights against Polish thugs and in the end goes to Palestine to build the Jewish state. And then for the women who don't have the same kind of education and the same kind of opportunities, for them the conflict expresses itself mainly in terms of marriage and career choices. So there's a daughter who is married off by her father to a rabbi and then realizes that she doesn't love him and she sort of wants to start this emotional quasi-sexual affair with another man. And there's another daughter, Bluma Rivcha, who's one of the main characters who wants to become a nurse, and so she goes off to study nursing. So all of the children, you could say, represent different ways of being modern, different ways of breaking away from Jewish tradition and leading a modern life. And if you would imagine what happens to them in the future, some of them go to America, some of them go to Israel, some of them might end up in the Soviet Union, but the ones who remain home will be killed in the Holocaust. And as someone said, and I think it's really important, this is a book written after the Holocaust by a survivor of the Holocaust that is not about the Holocaust at all, doesn't mention it, it's never written in a retrospective way or an elegiac way. You can tell that what he really wanted to do was plunge into this life as it felt at the time. And he's doing his best to recreate, if you're one of these Jews in a small village outside Vilna in the early 1930s, and what are there are lots of political debates. There are things that they're afraid of. Mainly what they're afraid of is boycotts by Polish nationalists. So one of the things that happens in the novel is that gangs of Polish nationalists stand in front of the Jewish shops and prevent Poles from going in to buy things, and this sort of brings ruin on the local economy. But there's no mention of Germany. There's no mention of Nazism or Hitler or any of that. So he's really trying to not make it backward-looking, to not say we know that this is going to end in a terrible way, and therefore we should understand this life sort of in sepia tones or in a mournful way. He's actually saying these were all very modern people leading modern lives, having debates, political debates, exactly like the ones that we have now. Not exactly the same ones, but similar debates. What's the best way to be a Jew? And Jews always disagree about that, and they fight with each other about it. People were doing that at the same time then. And then what's remarkable about it, and I think one of the keys to the power of the book, is that he doesn't take anyone's side. He doesn't say any of them is right and any of them is wrong. He really shows you why each of them thinks that they're right to take the path they took. The only exception is the professor, Naftali Hertz, who marries a Christian woman and lives life in Switzerland and then comes back to his parents' house in Moradalia, the village where everything takes place, and basically lies to them about what's going on because he can't admit that he's married outside the faith and that he's raising his children outside, his son outside of Judaism. So he just lies about what his life is like in Switzerland. He's a character who you could imagine being in like a Saul Bellow or a Philip Roth novel. He's like an alienated, self-conflicted Jewish intellectual who he can't break away from his faith, but he also can't continue it. And he does this thing which I think seems very familiar to me, where he says, I can be like non-observant and live the life I have, or I could go back and live the very strict ultra-Orthodox life my parents have, but on no account will I go to a Reformed synagogue in Switzerland, because he says that is not really
That's
Judaism.
trace. That's not
nothing.
Well, that's the amazing thing about this
Yeah.
text. There's no,
Yeah.
and in Grade in general, there's never any middle ground.
Right.
There's no room for compromise. It's either the world that Adam's talking about, the world where you're actually an Orthodox Jew,
Right.
or the world of Treif. But he's quite
He's
interested.
from in both directions.
Yeah, but he is.
Yes.
But what's so fascinating about this text, to go back to the anti-sentimental streak in it, it's the most, among the Yiddish novels that I've read, it's among the most, if not the most devastating portrait of the Jewish family. That is, when we think of this is the family novel. And when we think of Yiddish literature, and when we think of the myth that we've all created about the Jewish family and its cohesion, there isn't a single, these are sons and daughters who don't visit their parents, sometimes for years, who talk to one another with bile and bitterness. People are in loveless marriages. People are in betraying one another. There's talk of suicide among one of the characters. That is, if one is going to this world and expecting from Grade, wow, here we have an author who really lived through the 1930s. Now I'm going to get a world that was sort of this exciting world. That's not what he's trying to do.
And is he exposing that, or is that something that exists as a kind of an honest portrayal of
I think that's his experience in reading all of this. So you have parading through the novel at different moments, as Adam suggested, Zionists coming to town and talking about chalutzim and talking about Hebrew and why would anyone want to learn Hebrew? And then at another moment, you have Bundists coming into town, and the Bundist youth group then starts performing exercises and sport, and all these more Orthodox kids and families are looking at them going, who are these Jews? Then you have, of course, what you're talking about, the man who can't even admit to his parents that his son is uncircumcised and may not even know, too much about his own Jewishness, the son of a rabbi. And at a certain moment, in the most touching moment, I think, of the text, you have two of these rabbinic figures talking to one another, basically saying, despite having all these children, that we have no children. There's almost no one.
Those were the two brothers.
Right, who's decided that they are going to live the same life that the parents are living. And to me, it was heartbreaking, but it was also an honest portrait into a generational moment where everything was changing in the Jewish world. So if we're in a moment now, if sometimes it feels like we're at an inflection point where everything is changing and we might not recognize our own children or how our children identify as Jews, we can see that then resets. That is, that depression in the novel doesn't make me feel more depressed about our own moment, but just recognize that there are moments where everything seems upside down, but then comes back into some type of equilibrium. Not the same, but something that we could recognize as sane. He's very interested in this text. There's a moment where he talks about national consciousness. This goes back to the idea of he would never go into a shul with people who wear thin talesim, right?
Shlomo Kaba called it a bikini talit.
No bikini talesim. So he says, what's the difference between Eastern and Western Jews? There's a moment in the text where he talks about this, and he says that the Jews in the West lack national consciousness, whereas the Jews in Poland, whether they're religious Jews or whether they're Bundists or whether they're Zionists, they understand what it means to be a people, and their primary allegiance is to the Jewish people. Now, we can argue there are problems with that as well, but nonetheless, he's wrestling with that shift in what it means to be a people or just a religious minority or just an ethnic flavor.
Right. I mean, there's so much here that connects to Zionism today and living in Israel and why he didn't live in Israel and kind of very similar thematics for those who are wrestling with.
He was supposed to go to Israel.
Right.
In the 1930s, there was an announcement in the Yiddish press that Chaim Grade was leaving for Israel.
And
he never went.
why?
We don't know. But we know from a letter...
Mashiach would have come if he went.
We
Messiah would
know
have
that
come.
in the 1930s, after the Chazon Ish made Aliyah to Israel, he wrote to the Chazon Ish and said, how sort of recognizing how let down the Chazon Ish must be with his decision. And when Grade finally went to visit then the new state of Israel, the Chazon Ish was still alive. This just tells you something about Grade, who he was so close to and wrote about. He couldn't bring himself to go see the Chazon Ish. He was now, by then, a well-known Yiddish writer.
Because he was embarrassed?
We
don't know.
Because he was embarrassed over his life choices. He couldn't look the Chazon Ish in the face.
He writes about that in one of
He writes about that in one of his letters?
Yeah. It's
Because
devastating.
even though Chazon Ish was
devastating.
right, the greatest rabbi of the greatest halachic authority, and also in other Isaiah Karelitz, he was called the Chazon Ish, the man of vision.
He wrote a beautiful elegy and a long poem. Yeah.
He did.
About the Chazon Ish.
Chaim Grade did of Chazon Ish.
Absolutely beautiful to read.
So I saw Todd one.
Still his disciple.
He was still felt like he was his Talmud. His type. Todd, you wanted to jump in and had a section in the book.
As they were talking, there was just a very short passage that is one of my favorites in the book. I quote it often now. And it reminded me, as Adam was talking about, he shows you the sides, people pulling both ways and never takes a side, and that there's no middle. I had to read this very quickly, centering around Raphaelka, who's the youngest son. He's here talking with the Zembin rabbi. He says, "In your family, the children take after your fanatical grandfather, the Zembin rabbi. But he's a right-wing religious fanatic, and you are left-wing religious fanatics. Fanatics about free thinking. You don't know a middle road. A hand is either right or left. Have you ever seen a middle hand?" Raphaelka smiled, his dimples showing. "But the head is in the middle," Zindel retorted. That line, that knocked me out. It just is like...
Can you say that in Yiddish? Can you say the head is in the middle? How do you say that in Yiddish? The head is in the middle.
The cup is in
The cup in the mid. And so by that, he obviously meant that the thing that Grade was his mind itself can imagine many different sides and many different shades, and life is a bit more complicated than just right and left, but also a world in which that's great. That's a great passage. I know there are people here who would really love to ask questions, but I have a couple more, and then we'll open it up. So just to you, Rose. As someone who was a fiction writer and a translator, and you said that his writing was so Hamish for you. Was there something that resonated? Like, was there something about his writing that was different for you, that startled you, or that made? Had you been exposed to Yiddish writings that were so complex theologically, or where there was this wrestling match? You come from a very traditional community. Was exposure to Grade exposure to a world that you were familiar with?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's not one I've been asked before. But you know what? Now that you're asking it, I'm thinking that there are these websites online. They used to be more active. They're not as active anymore. There's the more right-wing, that's Eiwelt, but then there was Kavestiebel, which was a little bit, when I say left-wing, I mean Hasidish left-wing. But
in the middle, the head that's in the middle,
so
the left.
Yeah, exactly. So on Kavestiebel, which was basically a male sphere, they allowed women, but not with their names. Like, you had to give yourself... like, I didn't care if you read it or if you participated, but you had to give yourself a different name. But I would say there were a lot of such threads, such posts, such conversations where you'd read one and you'd think, wow, absolutely right. And then the other one would come with this whole long post and you'd say, absolutely right. And there were all these kinds of, right hand, left hand arguments, very similar to the type that Grade does in his book. Like, even the one with Chlavna, where it's supposedly meant to be based on him, when you read it, you're not 100% sure where Grada stands. Does he actually? He can't obviously believe that Yiddish is a jargon language, but yet he does this convincing argument for the other one. So in that way, it was kind of familiar.
He's the progenitor of Reddit.
Yeah, right.
Ready.
Can I interject just with one thing?
Yeah, sure, Justin, go ahead.
I wanted to push back for a moment, not on the wonderful review given in the New York Times, but on the headline of this as the last great Yiddish novel, and maybe unpack a little of that. Because I
Please.
think this idea, first of all, this idea of the last, this was something that would have been very interesting to Grade, right? That après moi la déluge, right? There's no one has seen it, no one has experienced it, so once I die, that world is closed. I think we want to be very careful in thinking about Yiddish as a closed system, right? That somehow after Grade, after Singer, after Chava Rosenfarb, that's it. I think that we are on the precipice of the great American Yiddish post-Hasidic novel. We don't know what type of ex-Hasidic people might come out and want to write in Yiddish. We don't know what type of Hasidic people might want to write in Yiddish. So I think that we want to really pause and not assume that this is the last. I think when we talk about great, we have to ask about what standards of greatness, right? Grade was writing this book for the press. So the book is a long book that in some cases, if tighter, might have been an even better and greater book, because it has nothing to do with the translation, than what we have before us. It's also a book, when we think of greatness, that in some ways harkens back to the 19th century Russian novel that you wrote about in the introduction. It's not the modernist experimental Yiddish novel. So really the greatness is its sweep, right? The sweep of characters, the sweep of ideas, the sweep of history. And then this idea of the last great Yiddish novel. That may seem the most obvious, right? Well, of course, it's a Yiddish novel, so at least, can't I agree with that? What I'm interested in the term Yiddish, though, is yes, of course, it's a Yiddish novel. But I think that because Yiddish also means Jewish, we need to think about this as perhaps the last great Jewish novel, if we think of it in the title. That is, can a language that's not Yiddish, or that's not Hebrew, or that's not any one of the Jewish vernaculars written in Aleph base, right? That is, can an American Jewish novel today, can a French Jewish novel, can a German Jewish novel aspire to be able to capture the same rhythms, the same internal religious, intellectual, social, political grammar that Grade is able to do. So it's not that it's not a great novel, it's not that it's not a great Yiddish novel, but it's functioning, when you think of, when you mention someone like Saul Bellow, right? So, and when we think of Jewish literature in general, what do Grade and Bellow
And Roth.
really, and Roth have in common?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to answer that.
Oh,
you want me to answer? No. But there are people now.
Sure.
Arguing over: is there such a thing as Jewish literature written in multiple languages, some of which is very alienated, like Kafka? I mean, when you think of how thick this novel is as a Jewish novel, and how thin Kafka is in writing about Jewishness, they're both writing about the same experience, but do they belong in the same literary tradition? Should they be taught together? What do they have to say to one another? I think there is such a thing as Jewish literature, but those who are post-nationalist and don't want to think about Jewish literature in that way will be far more resistant. They'll say there's an American Jewish literature,
Right.
And there's a Yiddish literature, and maybe even Yiddish literature is not as close to Hebrew literature as we thought.
Well, this comes back, again, to my question about about phenomenology, about language, about linguistics, semiotics, all of these questions about essentialism, right? To what degree was translation not just lost in translation because something can't be a referent, we can't find a referent in another language, but something that is more profoundly essentialist in some way, shape, or form about language and its formative power. And I think Ashkenazi normativity definitely is playing into this conversation. I mean, maybe Ladino and other Jewish linguistic artifacts might have something to say, but it's beautiful to hear this conversation. But as abstract as it might become, I think there are some very concrete questions that the people would like to ask.
I would ask Rose.
Adam,
Rose, do you think that there will be new American Yiddish fiction?
there is American Yiddish fiction, but it caters to the Hasidic world. So I don't know if you want to consider that literary fiction, but there is a whole bunch out there, and it's actually Yiddish print is thriving in the community, in our community. So.
Is it literary fiction in the same way that we would define it in like Grada, or
No, but a lot of it is a lot more insightful and deep and literary than people would imagine, because it keeps getting more, the appreciation of literature as an art form keeps becoming a little bit more prevalent in the community. So I would say there was this PhD group in Stanford, and they actually read a series from the Malice. One of them told me about it. This is what they did, their reading group, and they liked it. She said she found it the group did find it a lot deeper and more insightful than she'd imagined. So
before we turn to the audience, I just wanted to ask each of you to answer this, or whoever wants to jump in. Is it a stretch to ask why Grada now? Is it a stretch to ask if this particular novel, or Grada himself, in what we've just heard, and those who know his work, is a particularly important figure for this moment where we are Jewishly? I mean, you kind of alluded to this in terms of our kids, and is there more than that? Is there anyone want to speak to that before we open it? Justin?
I would say two things. Well, I'm so happy you used the term Ashkenormativity, because it didn't exist when I was a graduate student.
Yeah.
But I have all these students now coming to read Yiddish literature, right? And then I have all these other students thinking that the world of Yiddish literature that I had to beg for and sort of scratch my way into, that's now so popular, now people are saying, but all we do is talk about Yiddish. I'm like, if only all we did was talk about Yiddish. But the truth is, for years in the United States, we were talking about Hebrew literature, and Israeli literature, and Yiddish literature was left behind. Now, how I long for students who would read Hebrew literature, right? And the recognition, as Hebrew and Yiddish writers recognized at the time, that by choosing only Yiddish or choosing only Hebrew, you're looking at the world, and really the late 19th and the entire Jewish 20th century, with only one eye. There's more than one Yiddish writer and Hebrew writer who wrote that really most of these writers were bilingual. And that gave them access to so many other things. I think that Grad is having a moment. You'll talk a little bit about more of the discoveries and the ownership of the materials and why they couldn't be translated. But I think he's having a moment because he can be this bridge. He's this bridge figure. And one of the things that I need to teach my students over and over again, many of them come to Yiddish for a variety of reasons, some of which you can imagine, right? They see it as diasporic, they see it as radical, they see it as protest, they see it as gendered, they see it as martyred, and they see it differently than perhaps they would Hebrew. But they need to be reminded that for all that Yiddish, both in its radical politics and in America and in Europe, the period of Yiddish as what we would call secular language lasted for maybe 150 years. But this is a 1,000-year-old language. And for the first 850 years of this language, and perhaps now, it has returned to being the language of Derech HaShas. That is, it was a language of a religious civilization. And people spoke Yiddish in order to inoculate themselves initially from outside influences. So part of the excitement is that you bring people into Yiddish thinking that they're going to find an alternative. But then you have to remind them through Grade that alternative always leads back to the sources of the Jewish self. That is the text that he quotes, and this goes to your question about translation. One of the brilliant things about this translation is that it's readable for the target audience, but it still makes the audience work. It doesn't translate all of those titles. You have to go to the glossary if you don't know them. And even after you go to the glossary, which has a line or two, if you really want to know what's in those, you have to go and look them up and read them. That it's not the old type of translation where you translate the title into English and then add something that wasn't even there by the author. X book, comma, Maimonides writing about X, comma. They don't do that here. It's like, you want to read Grade? Then enter Grade's world. And I think that's why Grade is having a moment. There's a search for authenticity at the same time that people are rebelling. And they see him as someone who is authentic, who doesn't lie to them, who possesses this world.
Love Grada. I honestly, just like listening to you talking about Grada, just it's such a, so much for this moment, kind of authenticity and
Todd and I would have these discussions about what to keep. This was always like, we want it to be a smooth read, but we want that foreignization there. We want the Yiddish flavor there, because otherwise it's just another novel in English language. We did want it to read well and smoothly, and Todd did an amazing job on that, on smoothing out the rough edges, but also we wanted to retain a lot of that Yiddish flavor in it.
Adam, anything to add here? And we're gonna open it up for. Let's open it up. Okay, let's open it up. So it's going to be hard for people online to hear you. Otherwise, I would just let you all, and I'm not going to run around with a microphone. So if you don't mind just speaking loudly and clearly, and I'll repeat the question for those who are online, and then we'll do it. We'll go here.
I was struck by something that was said right at the beginning about how there are many references to names of trees and names of plants.
So something that Rose, the translator Rose Waldman, said in the beginning about she learned all about so many different kinds of trees. So something, the comment is to speak to the paucity within Yiddish, or the Yiddish that the question is coming from, is Yiddish kind of bereft of the fecundity of language around trees and other references to trees, and that also surprised you. You learned many words. Is he unique in that way?
So I'm not sure if he's unique in that way, but I can tell you that there are many more words than I had assumed there were. Because in my Yiddish, there's baimed, a boim and baimed. But here I learned about susna, and wait, I have to remember the word for willows. That kept being repeated. There were a bunch of words for plants and trees in here that I had never heard of. And same for foods. There were a lot of words for foods. Nice, I picked up some new things. But anyway, so to me, it definitely seemed rich. But maybe compared to other languages, it's not as rich. I don't know. I just, it did sound good to me.
Yeah, Justin, yeah?
But part of this goes to the assumptions that we bring to Yiddish. Yeah. So many writers turn to Yiddish early Yiddish writers, after trying to write in Hebrew, because there was so much more available in the Yiddish language, because it had been a living language. I'll never forget that Mordechai Schechter, the late professor at Columbia, late in his career wrote a couple of things that seemed curious for the moment in the United States. One was a list of botanical terms, and one was a list of terms on how to give birth and to raise children. So you'd figure, why would a professor of Yiddish linguistics, the most eminent one in the United States, spend his last years writing about trees and grass and plants and flowers and about childbirth? Part of it was about continuity, but the other part of it was to a little bit of a shtoch, I think, and a necessary shtoch, to say, you think that this language is dying, you think that this language is dead, you think this language was only about the yeshiva and about holidays and about politics. There was a time when Yiddish was young. There was a time when there were Yiddish scouts. There was a time when Yiddish, where there was a time, I just finished an article, so this is on my mind, about exactly to this question, where there was a group of Yiddish scouts. Grade was in that world in Vilna, and the whole point of this Yiddish scouting movement was to, and this is in the words of one of the teachers, to teach young Yiddish-speaking children about a world where the birds spoke Yiddish. That there is a language for this, a thick language.
Wow. That's beautiful. Okay, this gentleman here, so patient.
I speak a fluent Yiddish. I read and write Yiddish.
So you speak in, and
I've read every Chaim Grade book in Yiddish.
Great.
But I would say one thing about Yiddish, and Isaac Bashevis Singer made his speech in Oslo. He said, Yiddish did not make its last words. And I think most people don't appreciate that Yiddish intersected with many secular issues in the 18 and 1900s, in which many Jewish writers tried to embrace secular subjects, particularly the early Yiddish writers like Mendele Moichas Ayel Peretz, Shalom Aleichem. They tried to deal with the shtetl world and the intersection with its destruction. And the new Jewish writers like, obviously, Singer and his brother. His brother was the great writer. And more importantly...
And his sister.
And sister, the Schwester. And one has to remember, even Grade, when Grade died, people had to go to his apartment to find his works. They did not even know how much he had written until they went into his apartment. So he was even greater than people even knew. And I'd make one final point, which is really important. The Jewish world needs to embrace all its dimensions. Because the more it embraces, the more it understands its richness. Its richness is not only its languages, its traditions, its literature, its poetry, its cultural expansion. And Yiddish is one dimension of that.
And I would agree, and the one thing that I always tell my students...
I wish I were one of your students.
Right, well, the one thing I always tell them when they ask, like, do you have any regrets? And the one regret, I mean, I think the biggest regret that I have is that I wasn't born into a Jewish language, that I had to learn it. That all, right, but I'm saying that this is, for those of us not born into a Jewish language, it's just a different experience navigating these worlds. It's always an uphill climb.
I completely agree. And I grew up in a house where my parents spoke Yiddish, but only so that we couldn't understand them. And although we did also grow up with Hebrew. When I eventually went from being modern Orthodox to being ultra Orthodox, and during my 5 or 6 years in that universe, Yiddish words that I'd never heard before became perfect. I felt like an entire, geschmack, Gois, it was just a very different. It landed differently. It painted a universe. Yeah, there is something beautiful about your question and comment. Absolutely, it is extremely. So I want to also get to a couple more questions. Thank you so much. Very rich comments.
Just a question, not a spiel. Given how conflicted Grade was about his orthodoxy, I'm just wondering, in America, what was his actual relationship to observance and Yahadut? I mean, did he just, I can't believe he just flat out rejected it. Did he have any relationship with the Orthodox world? And what was
So, okay, I'll take.
Yeah,
And also, if you can read the letters, there's a lot of that gets answered there, but I'll take go.
In his lifetime, Chaim Grade worked with translators who did the Aguna, the yeshiva, and one of them, I think it was Kurt Leviant, who came to his apartment, and it was around April. And Kurt Leviant talks about this in an interview, and he says he sees there's this big square cardboard box, and he looks at it, and it's a box of shmura matzah. And Kurt Leviant says to him, "What are you doing with shmura matzah?" He said, "Do you have a seder?" And Grade said, "What kind of a question? Was kein Frage. Of course I have a seder." So there you go.
I think Yehuda Zirkin, who is the one who found us the letters, wrote his thesis on this, exactly on this topic, like the tension that Grade lived with all his life. And he brings a lot of sources, his conversations with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then some other things. I think there's a mention of his putting on tefillin once. So, and that's in English, and it's probably accessible online. So if you're curious. Yes, right. Yeah.
And this doesn't answer the question of orthodoxy, but in a speech that he gave in 1939 to celebrate the publication of Musarnikas, which was his epic poem about his experiences in the Musar Yeshiva, he says in Vilna, it's just amazing, we must seek out spiritual confidence in our own histories, strength in our heroic example of goodness, and courage at this time of catastrophe. I mean, this was his sense of being a writer, and then he ends saying that he wanted to be a poet of the Jewish people, not a poet who happened to be Jewish and wrote in Yiddish. So he had that sense of, there was something in him.
Is there anybody today, I'm sorry guys, I just asked you, I have them. Is there anyone today that mimics this literarily and philosophically in the Jewish world, this being between worlds in the moment, not between a vanished world, but like in the moment? Who would be the Grada stepchild in this moment? Do we have any examples of that, Adam? Do we?
No.
Do we need examples?
I think it's, no, I don't think so, but I do think maybe this gets back to the question of what he says to us now. I think it's possible that this book will mean more to younger readers today than it would have if it had been published when it was first written. Because I think that just in general in American Jewish literature, writers and readers are a lot more interested in the past and in religion than they were 50 years ago. I think if you look at the great American Jewish writers of the post-war generation, like Roth and Bellow and Malamud, they basically didn't know or care much about Judaism or the history of Judaism. They were writing about here and now and American Jewish life, and of course brilliantly. But I think that if you look at younger writers, and now, like me, they're no longer so young, but I'm thinking of people like Nicole Krauss or Dara Horn, people who were born in the 1970s and 1980s, they're very interested in the past and in Jewish history, and they have read the books. They have gone back to learn about some of these things. So I think that maybe these readers will be more receptive to a novel like this than people would have been in the 60s and 70s.
We're okay. Can we take one more? Okay. Thanks, Todd. And there's so much to talk about, but the Y is very, we talked about Litvish, the Y is very Yekish.
I see.
And so we have to end slightly on time. Hi.
I was wondering, when you come across a word you don't know and it doesn't translate to a simple noun, what sources do you turn to figure out what it means, and how do you get to a feeling of confidence that you've really captured it?
I start with a dictionary. Like, there were a lot of words that I didn't know. And so I would start with a dictionary. So we have now the Bachner-Beinfeld, which is very accessible and easy to work with. And I worked with that a lot. They also have an online version. And if I couldn't find the answer, then I would just ask like fellow Hasidim who have a good Yiddish, and I'd find it. Yes, and I'd get a lot of answers that way, more from men than from women. The women do not have as good a Yiddish and have the better English. So that would be another thing. If that didn't help, I would turn to Facebook, to the translator community, and pretty much that's the process. And
was there anything that you worried had like a cultural salience then that you would miss out on now?
I'm trying to think, because the world was not that different. I mean, there was a question here before about, Grada now, why now? I found almost everything very relevant, and almost like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, the traditional community for sure grapples with the exact same issues that they did, and then the Jewish community at large grapples with this, with anti-Semitism and all of those things that the book talks about. So I'm trying to think of anything felt out of place or that would no longer. I don't think so. I think it pretty much is very relevant, and in a way, almost. I think Todd, you once called it like a modern book. So in a sense, it is that, I think.
So with that, we have to actually come to bring our program to a close. I want to thank each and every one of you for bringing this book, into the world in its current form and translation. I'm sure many who are going to read it now will have access in a way to the beauty of Grada and to the complexity of this book. There it is. It's heavy enough. It's good, hefty, and it's. It's serving a lot of functions. So thank you all for coming out on a Thursday night.